Deep in the shadow-carved valleys of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to mountain peaks like ancient secrets, certain family names were never spoken above a whisper, not out of respect, but pure terror. These weren't just backwoods clans struggling to survive in America's forgotten hollows. These were dynasties built on blood, fear, and violence so brutal that even today, local historians refuse to document their full stories. When federal marshals received orders to investigate these families, many simply resigned rather than venture into territories where the law meant nothing and bullets settled every dispute. Between 1860 and 1950, 9 families carved out criminal empires in the Appalachian wilderness, creating kingdoms of terror that operated beyond the reach of civilization. Their stories were deliberately buried, their crimes covered up, their victims forgotten. But the mountains remember everything, and today we're uncovering the blood-soaked legacies of families so dangerous that their very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about justice in America. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to discover isn't taught in any history class. These are the true stories of America's most deadly mountain dynasties, families whose names still make old-timers in Appalachian towns lock their doors when the sun goes down. The Hatfield dynasty stands as perhaps the most infamous of all Appalachian crime families, though most people only know half their story. Led by the towering figure of Anderson Devil Anse Hatfield, this clan didn't just engage in a simple family feud. They operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that controlled logging operations, moonshine distribution, and coal mining interests across 3 states. What started as a dispute with the McCoys over a stolen pig quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Devil Anse Hatfield was a Civil War veteran who returned home with military tactical knowledge and a complete disregard for civilian law. He assembled his family into what functioned as a private army, complete with designated roles, strategic planning, and coordinated attacks. The Hatfields controlled river crossings along the Tug Fork, effectively taxing anyone who wanted to transport goods through their territory. Those who refused to pay found their boats riddled with bullet holes, their cargo confiscated, and sometimes their bodies floating downstream. The family's signature method of intimidation involved what they called the Hatfield calling card. After eliminating enemies, they would leave behind a single playing card, usually the ace of spades, nailed to a tree or cabin door. This psychological warfare proved incredibly effective, as entire communities would abandon their homes rather than risk becoming targets. Local sheriffs learned to recognize these cards and often refused to investigate crimes in Hatfield territory. But the true extent of their brutality became clear during the New Year's massacre of 1888. The Hatfields didn't just attack the McCoy cabin in a fit of rage. They had spent weeks planning the assault, studying the family's routines, identifying escape routes, and positioning gunmen at strategic points around the property. When they finally struck, they surrounded the cabin before dawn, set it ablaze, and methodically shot down family members as they fled the burning structure. What made this attack particularly horrifying was its calculated nature. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated execution designed to send a message to anyone who dared oppose Hatfield authority. The aftermath revealed the true scope of their criminal network. Investigation into the massacre uncovered evidence of bribery involving local officials, connections to organized crime syndicates in major cities, and financial records showing the family's annual income exceeded that of most legitimate businesses in the region. Devil Aunts had transformed what appeared to be a backwoods family feud into a multi-state criminal enterprise worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even more disturbing were the family's recruitment methods. The Hatfields didn't limit their organization to blood relatives. They systematically recruited young men from impoverished families, offering them steady income in exchange for absolute loyalty. These recruits underwent what amounted to military training, learning marksmanship, guerrilla tactics, and methods of intimidation. Those who proved themselves were eventually inducted into the inner circle through a blood oath ceremony that local folklore claims involved drinking from a cup mixed with the blood of previous enemies. The Hatfields' influence extended far beyond their mountain stronghold. They maintained safe houses in cities like Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, allowing them to conduct business transactions and launder money from their various illegal enterprises. Federal investigators later discovered that Devil Aunts had established relationships with corrupt officials in multiple state governments, effectively purchasing protection from prosecution. What finally brought down the Hatfield organization wasn't law enforcement, but internal betrayal. As Devil Aunts aged, disputes arose among his sons over succession. The family split into competing factions, each claiming legitimate leadership. This internal warfare proved more destructive than any external threat they had faced. By 1891, the organization had effectively destroyed itself through fratricidal violence. The McCoy family, often portrayed as innocent victims in historical accounts, were far from helpless mountain farmers. Under the leadership of Randolph Randall McCoy, they operated their own criminal network that rivaled the Hatfields in both scope and brutality. What most people don't realize is that the famous feud wasn't really about family honor or stolen livestock. It was a turf war between two organized crime families fighting for control of lucrative moonshine territory and illegal gambling operations. Randall McCoy had learned the moonshine trade from his father, who had been running illegal stills since before the Civil War. By the 1870s, the McCoy operation had grown into a sophisticated distribution network that supplied whiskey to cities throughout Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio. They used a complex system of hidden trails, secret codes, and trusted couriers to move their product while avoiding federal revenue agents. The McCoys' primary advantage over their rivals lay in their intelligence network. They had infiltrated local law enforcement agencies, placing family members and loyal associates in positions where they could provide advance warning of raids and investigations. Sheriff's Deputy Jim McCoy, Randall's cousin, regularly passed along information about planned law enforcement operations, allowing the family to relocate their stills and hide evidence before authorities arrived. But the McCoys' true specialty was elimination of competition. They didn't engage in direct confrontation like the Hatfields preferred. Instead, they used more subtle methods. Rival moonshine operations would suffer mysterious explosions that destroyed entire facilities. Competing distillers would disappear during routine trips to market, their bodies never recovered. Revenue agents who proved too persistent in their investigations would find themselves transferred to distant assignments after receiving threats against their families. The McCoy organization also pioneered what law enforcement would later recognize as protection racket tactics. Small-scale moonshine producers in their territory were required to pay a percentage of their profits to the McCoy family in exchange for protection from raids and rival gangs. Those who refused often found their operations sabotaged, their equipment destroyed, and their lives threatened. What made the McCoys particularly dangerous was their ability to manipulate public perception. While the Hatfields ruled through fear and intimidation, the McCoys cultivated an image of themselves as righteous mountain folk defending their traditional way of life against outside interference. They portrayed their criminal activities as resistance to unfair government taxation and regulation, gaining sympathy from local populations who resented federal authority. This propaganda campaign proved remarkably effective. Even after evidence of their criminal activities became undeniable, many locals continued to view the McCoys as folk heroes rather than criminals. This public support provided them with a steady stream of recruits and safe houses throughout the region. The McCoy family's downfall came not from their war with the Hatfields, but from their own success. As their operation grew larger and more profitable, it attracted attention from federal authorities who were beginning to crack down on organized crime. The creation of specialized revenue agent units specifically trained to combat moonshine operations made their traditional methods of avoiding detection increasingly ineffective. The final blow came when one of their most trusted lieutenants, facing federal charges that would have resulted in decades in prison, agreed to testify against the family in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the full extent of the McCoy criminal empire, including detailed records of bribes paid to officials, evidence of multiple murders, and documentation of their sophisticated money laundering operations. Moving deeper into Appalachian darkness, we encounter the Melundian families of eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. These mysterious people, with their olive skin, distinctive facial features, and uncertain ethnic heritage, became the subject of wild speculation and darker fears. But the truth about certain Melundian clans was far more disturbing than any folklore. The core Melundian families, particularly the Collins, Goins, and Gibson lineages, had indeed been living in the mountains since before official European settlement. Their isolation wasn't entirely voluntary. These families possessed knowledge and practices that made even hardened mountain folk uncomfortable. They understood the mountains in ways that seemed supernatural to outsiders, navigating treacherous terrain without maps, predicting weather changes with uncanny accuracy, and finding game when experienced hunters returned empty-handed. But it was their understanding of human nature that made them truly dangerous. The Melundians had developed sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation that they used to control territory and eliminate threats. They would study their enemies for months, learning their fears, weaknesses, and superstitions. Then they would orchestrate elaborate campaigns of terror designed to drive opponents to madness or suicide. Their signature method involved what they called night singing. Melundian operatives would position themselves around an enemy's home after dark, producing haunting vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. These weren't random sounds, but carefully composed psychological attacks designed to prevent sleep and induce paranoia. Victims would report hearing voices calling their names, children crying in the woods, and otherworldly music that seemed to come from underground. The Melundians also practiced a form of biological warfare that wouldn't be understood until the development of modern medicine. They cultivated specific plants and fungi that produced hallucinogenic and toxic compounds, then introduced these substances into their enemies' food and water supplies. Victims would experience terrifying hallucinations, develop mysterious illnesses, and sometimes die from conditions that local doctors couldn't diagnose or treat. What made the Melundians particularly feared was their apparent ability to operate as a collective intelligence. Information spread through their communities with impossible speed, allowing them to coordinate activities across vast distances without any visible communication network. Travelers through Melundian territory reported feeling constantly watched, as if the mountains themselves were alive and hostile. Federal investigators who attempted to study Melundian communities in the early 1900s encountered unprecedented resistance. Documents would disappear from locked offices, photographs would be found destroyed in developing chemicals, and researchers would suffer mysterious accidents that forced them to abandon their work. Several investigators reported experiencing shared nightmares featuring identical imagery of underground chambers and ritualistic ceremonies. The most disturbing aspect of Melundian culture was their treatment of outsiders who discovered too much about their activities. Rather than simply killing intruders, they would subject them to elaborate psychological torture designed to destroy their credibility and sanity. Victims would be released after weeks or months of captivity, but they would return to civilization with fragmented memories and claims so bizarre that authorities dismissed them as mentally ill. The Melundian families began to disperse in the mid-1900s as modern communication and transportation systems made their traditional isolation impossible to maintain. Many integrated into mainstream society, hiding their heritage and abandoning their ancestral practices. But some families retreated deeper into the mountains, establishing hidden communities that continue to exist beyond the reach of modern authorities. The Shepherd clan of eastern Kentucky represents perhaps the most militaristic of all Appalachian criminal families. Unlike other mountain outlaws who adapted existing criminal methods to their environment, the Shepherds developed entirely new forms of guerrilla warfare, specifically designed for the mountainous terrain of their territory. The family's criminal enterprise began during Reconstruction when former Confederate soldiers found themselves excluded from legitimate economic opportunities. Led by Colonel Marcus Shepherd, a decorated Civil War veteran, the family initially engaged in typical post-war banditry, but Marcus possessed a tactical knowledge that transformed simple robbery into sophisticated military operations. The Shepherds established what amounted to a private military compound in the most remote section of Floyd County. Their property was surrounded by elaborate defensive fortifications, including trenches, bunkers, and concealed firing positions that could withstand assault by conventional law enforcement. The family maintained an arsenal that included military-grade weapons acquired through theft and black market purchases. What set the Shepherds apart was their systematic approach to territorial control. They divided their territory into operational zones, each with designated patrol routes, communication systems, and emergency protocols. Family members underwent regular military-style training that included marksmanship, explosives handling, and survival techniques. They maintained detailed maps showing the locations of law enforcement facilities, transportation routes, and potential escape paths. The Shepherds' signature tactic involved what they called invisible warfare. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation, they would systematically eliminate their enemies through seemingly unrelated accidents and incidents. A rival moonshiner might die in a hunting accident when his rifle mysteriously exploded. A revenue agent might fall to his death from a mountain trail where loose rocks had been strategically positioned. A local sheriff who proved too persistent might succumb to food poisoning after eating at a restaurant where shepherd associates worked in the kitchen. These methods proved devastatingly effective because they left no clear evidence of criminal activity. Each incident appeared to be a tragic accident or coincidence, making it impossible for authorities to build criminal cases against the family. Even when patterns became obvious to experienced investigators, the lack of physical evidence made prosecution impossible. The shepherds also pioneered the use of environmental warfare in their mountain territory. They would alter natural features to create hidden advantages, redirecting streams to flood areas where enemies might take shelter, weakening tree branches along trails frequently used by law enforcement, and creating rock slides that could be triggered to block escape routes during operations. Their intelligence network was particularly sophisticated. The family recruited informants in every town within a 50-mile radius of their compound, creating a communication system that provided real-time information about law enforcement activities, rival gang movements, and potential business opportunities. This network included postal workers, telegraph operators, store clerks, and even church ministers who would report unusual activities or conversations they overheard. The shepherds' downfall came when they made the mistake of targeting federal revenue agents during Prohibition. Their previous victims had been local criminals and law enforcement officers whose deaths could be attributed to the general lawlessness of the region. But when 3 federal agents disappeared while investigating shepherd territory, it triggered a massive federal response that overwhelmed their defensive capabilities. The final raid on the shepherd compound involved over 100 federal agents supported by National Guard units. Even with their military training and defensive positions, the family couldn't withstand a coordinated assault by superior numbers. The compound was overrun after a 3-day siege that left most of the family dead and their criminal empire permanently destroyed. However, evidence suggests that some shepherd family members escaped the final raid and continued their activities in other regions. Law enforcement agencies reported similar tactical methods being used by criminal organizations in West Virginia and Tennessee during the following decades, suggesting that surviving shepherds had established new operations beyond their original territory. The story continues with even darker revelations about families whose crimes transcended simple violence and entered realms that challenge our understanding of human depravity. But these first 4 families alone reveal how the isolation and lawlessness of the Appalachian Mountains created conditions where criminal dynasties could flourish beyond anything seen in more civilized regions of America. The mountains kept their secrets well, but eventually, blood always tells its story, and these families left behind legacies written in violence that would haunt the hollows of Appalachia for generations to come. The history books want you to believe that civilization came to the mountains slowly, carried by railroad tracks and mining companies. But long before the first steam engine whistled through these ancient passes, something else had already taken root in the deepest hollows. The Pernal family understood this truth better than most, which is why their criminal empire lasted longer and cut deeper than any of their predecessors. Unlike the blood feuds and territory wars we've already explored, the Pernals practiced a different kind of violence. They were the puppet masters who rarely bloodied their own hands, preferring to orchestrate the destruction of their enemies through careful manipulation and strategic alliance building. What made them truly dangerous wasn't their willingness to kill, but their ability to convince others to do their killing for them. The Pernal dynasty began in 1845 when Matthias Pernal arrived in Breathitt County, Kentucky, carrying nothing but a carpetbag and an uncanny ability to rid people's deepest desires and fears. Within 6 months, he had married the widow of the county's wealthiest landowner, a woman whose husband had died under mysterious circumstances just 3 weeks after Matthias's arrival. Local gossips whispered about the timing, but no one could prove anything. That would become the Pernal signature. Events that seemed coincidental but followed patterns too convenient to be natural. Matthias established what he called a consultation service for local disputes. Families facing land disagreements, business conflicts, or personal vendettas would seek his counsel, paying modest fees for his advice on how to resolve their problems. What they didn't realize was that Matthias was simultaneously counseling both sides of every conflict, carefully escalating tensions while positioning himself as the only neutral party capable of providing solutions. His method was devastatingly effective. He would study each family involved in a dispute, identifying their weaknesses, their allies, their sources of income, and their deepest fears. Then he would begin planting seeds of suspicion and paranoia through seemingly innocent conversations and carefully placed rumors. A casual mention that someone had been seen talking to their enemies. A suggestion that recent accidents might not have been accidental. A piece of gossip about financial difficulties that could motivate desperate actions. As conflicts escalated, Matthias would offer increasingly dramatic solutions. When the Henderson and Morrison families became locked in a boundary dispute that he had secretly been inflaming for months, he suggested that a demonstration of force might convince the other side to be reasonable. He provided information about when each family would be most vulnerable, offered to loan weapons, and even suggested specific tactics. When the resulting confrontation left 3 men dead and 2 families destroyed, Matthias emerged as the helpful mediator who negotiated the survivors' departure from the county. The abandoned land was sold for taxes, and Matthias purchased it through a series of shell transactions for a fraction of its value. The Pernal family's influence grew as Matthias recruited his sons into the operation. Each son specialized in different aspects of manipulation. Jeremiah became expert at financial pressure, establishing relationships with banks and creditors that allowed him to orchestrate foreclosures and bankruptcies. Caleb focused on legal manipulation, studying law and establishing connections with judges and prosecutors who could be influenced through blackmail or bribery. Isaiah specialized in what they called social engineering, the careful cultivation of rumors, gossip, and public opinion. By the 1870s, the Pernals controlled an invisible empire spanning 3 counties. They owned substantial property, controlled multiple businesses, and held influence over local government, all while maintaining the appearance of being respectable community leaders. Matthias served on church boards and charity committees. His sons were prominent businessmen and civic leaders. To outside observers, they were pillars of the community. But beneath this veneer of respectability, the Pernals operated the most sophisticated criminal organization in Appalachian history. They maintained detailed files on every family in their territory, documenting financial situations, family relationships, personal secrets, and potential leverage points. These files were hidden in a specially constructed vault beneath the Pernal family home, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind a false wall in the basement. The vault contained more than just intelligence files. The Pernels had collected evidence of crimes committed by others, often crimes they had orchestrated or encouraged. They possessed signed confessions obtained through coercion, photographs of compromising situations they had arranged, and financial records proving corruption they had facilitated. This evidence served as insurance, ensuring that even if someone suspected their involvement in various schemes, they would never dare to speak publicly. Their most chilling innovation was what they called proxy justice. When the Pernals decided that someone needed to be eliminated, they rarely took direct action. Instead, they would identify existing enemies of their target and provide those enemies with means, motive, and opportunity to act. A feuding neighbor might discover that their target would be traveling alone on a specific date. A business rival might learn about a financial vulnerability that could be exploited. A wronged family member might receive anonymous information about past betrayals. The beauty of this system was that the Pernels could eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability. When Samuel Crawford, a federal revenue agent who had been investigating their moonshine connections, was found dead in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, the perpetrators were quickly identified as three local men with gambling debts and criminal records. What authorities didn't know was that those debts had been purchased by Pernal intermediaries, that the men had been provided with inside information about Crawford's routines, and that they had been psychologically manipulated into believing that Crawford was responsible for recent raids that had cost them money. The Pernel's proxy justice system claimed dozens of victims over the decades. Competing businessmen died in accidents arranged by desperate debtors who owed money to Pernal-controlled creditors. Potential witnesses disappeared, killed by people who had been convinced they were avenging old wrongs. Reform-minded politicians found themselves facing scandals orchestrated by enemies they had made years earlier, enemies who had been carefully preserved and weaponized by Pernal manipulation. What made the Pernels truly terrifying was their patience. They would spend years developing a single asset, carefully nurturing grievances and dependencies that could be activated when needed. They maintained relationships with criminals, debtors, revenge seekers, and desperate people throughout the region, treating them like a carefully tended garden of potential weapons. The family's downfall began in 1923 when they made the mistake of targeting the wrong person. Judge Harrison Mills had been investigating irregularities in land transfers and tax assessments that pointed toward a coordinated scheme of property manipulation. The Pernels identified a perfect proxy to eliminate him, Thomas Brennan, whose family had lost their farm through foreclosure proceedings overseen by Mills 5 years earlier. The Pernels provided Brennan with detailed information about Mills's routines, suggested a method of attack that would appear to be a robbery, and even arranged for him to acquire an untraceable weapon. The plan proceeded flawlessly until Brennan, consumed by guilt after the killing, attempted suicide and left behind a detailed confession that implicated the Pernels in not only Mills's death, but in a pattern of manipulation dating back decades. Federal investigators who arrived to investigate Mills's assassination discovered evidence of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy in regional history. The vault beneath the Pernal home contained files documenting hundreds of manipulated conflicts, orchestrated crimes, and coerced actions. Financial records showed a network of shell companies, bribery schemes, and corruption that extended into multiple state governments. But even facing federal prosecution, the Pernals had one final manipulation to deploy. Caleb Pernal, the family's legal specialist, had spent years cultivating relationships with federal judges and prosecutors. When the case went to trial, key evidence mysteriously disappeared from secure storage. Witnesses died in apparent accidents or suddenly refused to testify. The prosecution's case gradually disintegrated due to procedural errors and legal technicalities that Caleb had carefully engineered from within the system. The Pernal family was never convicted of any crime. Official records show that the case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence and procedural irregularities. But their empire had been exposed, their methods revealed, and their network of assets compromised. They quietly dispersed from the region, selling their properties and businesses through the same shell companies they had used to acquire them. The legacy of the Pernals extends far beyond their years of active operation. Law enforcement agencies studying organized crime would later recognize their methods as precursors to sophisticated psychological manipulation and social engineering techniques used by modern criminal organizations. Their systematic approach to blackmail, their use of proxy actors, and their careful cultivation of assets became templates studied by both criminals and law enforcement professionals. More disturbing is the evidence that Pernal methods never truly disappeared from the region. Throughout the 20th century, investigators noted patterns of conflict and violence that bore the hallmarks of outside manipulation. Families that had lived peacefully for generations would suddenly erupt into violent feuds. Business rivals would destroy each other through escalating conflicts that seemed to follow scripts. Political candidates would face perfectly timed scandals involving enemies from their distant past. Local historians who have studied these patterns refuse to speak publicly about their findings, but private conversations reveal their belief that Pernal techniques were passed down through networks of associates and apprentices. The family may have left the mountains, but their methods remained, practiced by successors who understood the power of invisible manipulation. The second family that reshaped Appalachian crime during this period operated from an entirely different philosophical foundation. While the Pernals manipulated others into violence, the Grayson clan of eastern Tennessee believed that violence itself was a sacred art that should be practiced with religious devotion and ritual precision. The Graysons weren't simply killers. They were what modern psychologists would recognize as a multi-generational cult built around the worship of death as a transformative spiritual experience. Their crimes weren't motivated by greed, territory, or revenge, but by a twisted theology that viewed murder as a form of religious sacrament that brought them closer to divine truth. The family's violent ideology originated with Ezekiel Grayson, a former Methodist preacher who had been defrocked in 1851 for promoting what church authorities described as blasphemous interpretations of biblical sacrifice. Ezekiel had become obsessed with Old Testament accounts of ritual sacrifice, developing elaborate theories about how the taking of human life could serve as a form of communion with God. After his expulsion from the Methodist Church, Ezekiel retreated to a remote valley in the Cumberland Mountains, where he established what he called the true church of sacred transition. His congregation consisted entirely of his extended family, his wife, his 7 children, their spouses, and eventually their children. What began as unorthodox religious services gradually evolved into something far more sinister. Ezekiel taught that conventional Christianity had lost touch with the fundamental truth that God demanded blood sacrifice as proof of devotion. He cited biblical accounts of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, of God's requirement for animal sacrifices in the Old Testament, and of Christ's death as the ultimate sacrifice. But Ezekiel's interpretation went beyond traditional theology. He believed that the faithful could achieve spiritual enlightenment by serving as instruments of God's judgment, identifying and eliminating those who had been marked for divine punishment. The family's first murder occurred in 1854 when they killed a traveling merchant who had allegedly cheated them in a business transaction. But rather than treating it as a simple act of revenge, the Graysons surrounded the killing with elaborate ritual. They held prayer services before and after the murder, treated the victim's blood as a sacred substance, and preserved portions of his clothing and personal effects as religious relics. Ezekiel declared the experience a spiritual revelation, claiming that he had felt the presence of God during the killing and that the family had been blessed with divine approval. This interpretation transformed murder from a criminal act into a religious duty, providing theological justification for increasingly frequent and ritualized killings. The Graysons developed an elaborate theology around their violence. They believed that God communicated with them through dreams and visions, providing the names and descriptions of people who needed to be eliminated. Family members would fast and pray until they received what they interpreted as divine instructions about their next target. These instructions were recorded in detailed journals that treated murder planning as a form of scriptural interpretation. Their killing methods became increasingly ritualized over time. Victims were required to undergo what the Graysons called preparation, a process that involved spiritual counseling designed to help them understand and accept their role in God's plan. This wasn't mere sadism, but a genuine belief that they were helping their victims achieve spiritual transformation through death. The preparation process could last for days or weeks. Victims were held in specially constructed chambers beneath the Grayson family compound, spaces that had been designed to facilitate meditation and prayer. The chambers were decorated with religious symbols, furnished with Bibles and hymnals, and equipped with everything needed for extended religious services. During preparation, family members would take turns counseling the victim, explaining the theological basis for their upcoming death and encouraging them to embrace their role in God's plan. They would hold prayer services with the victim, sing hymns, and conduct what they believed were healing ceremonies designed to purify the victim's soul before death. The actual killings followed precise ritual protocols. The victim would be dressed in white robes, positioned on an altar constructed according to specifications that Ezekiel claimed had been revealed to him in visions, and killed using methods that the family believed had biblical precedent. Blood was collected in ceremonial vessels, mixed with wine, and consumed by family members as a form of communion. After each killing, the family would hold elaborate funeral services for their victims, treating them as martyrs who had achieved spiritual transformation through death. They maintained detailed records of each victim's final words, their apparent state of mind during preparation, and any signs that were interpreted as divine approval of the killing. The Graysons' victims weren't chosen randomly. The family developed an elaborate system for identifying people they believed had been marked for divine judgment. They studied local communities for signs of moral corruption, financial impropriety, or spiritual apostasy. They particularly targeted people they viewed as enemies of true religion, ministers who preached doctrines they considered heretical, business leaders who they believed were exploiting the poor, and government officials who they saw as corrupting traditional values. Their intelligence gathering was remarkably sophisticated. Family members would integrate themselves into target communities, attending churches, participating in social events, and establishing relationships that allowed them to gather detailed information about potential victims. They maintained extensive files on people they were monitoring, documenting everything from daily routines to personal relationships to financial situations. The Graysons also practiced what they called spiritual surveillance, claiming that God provided them with supernatural knowledge about their enemies. Family members reported receiving visions that revealed hidden sins, prophetic dreams that predicted future events, and direct communications from God that provided specific instructions about timing and methods for their killings. This supernatural element made the Graysons particularly difficult for law enforcement to predict or capture. Their actions appeared random to outside observers because they were based on religious visions rather than conventional criminal motives. A wealthy businessman might be killed not because of any specific grievance, but because a family member had received a vision showing him surrounded by darkness. A traveling preacher might be targeted because someone had dreamed of him standing in a lake of fire. The family's religious fanaticism also made them incredibly dangerous to law enforcement personnel who attempted to investigate their activities. They viewed any interference with their divine mission as evidence of satanic opposition that needed to be eliminated through spiritual warfare. Several federal marshals and local sheriffs who investigated mysterious disappearances in Grayson territory were themselves found dead, their bodies positioned in ways that suggested ritual killing. The Graysons maintained their operations for over 4 decades, claiming an estimated 47 victims before their final confrontation with federal authorities in 1895. Their downfall came when they made the mistake of targeting the daughter of a prominent judge, believing that she had been marked for sacrifice because of visions experienced by Ezekiel's grandson. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of their religious murder cult. Federal agents discovered the underground chambers where victims had been held, the altars where they had been killed, and extensive journals documenting decades of ritualized murder. The evidence was so disturbing that much of it was sealed by federal order and never made public. The surviving Grayson family members were tried for multiple murders, but their defense strategy proved remarkably effective. They claimed religious exemption for their actions, arguing that they were protected by constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. Their lawyers presented them not as criminals, but as sincere religious practitioners whose beliefs, however unusual, were constitutionally protected. The theological defense created a legal nightmare for prosecutors. How could the government prove that religious beliefs were insincere? How could constitutional religious protections be balanced against criminal law? The case dragged on for years, with appeals reaching the Supreme Court and establishing precedents that continue to influence religious freedom cases today. Ultimately, most of the Grayson family members received relatively light sentences or were acquitted entirely due to the constitutional complexities of their case. But their release from prison didn't end their story. Federal agents continued to monitor the family for decades, documenting evidence that they had resumed their ritualized killings in new locations under new identities. The true horror of the Grayson legacy lies not in their body count, but in the evidence that their religious ideology survived and spread. Throughout the 20th century, law enforcement agencies encountered isolated cases of ritualized murders that bore striking similarities to Grayson methods. Victims found positioned on makeshift altars, killed according to religious protocols, surrounded by evidence of elaborate spiritual preparation. These copycat killings suggested that Grayson religious writings had been preserved and circulated among other extremist groups, creating an underground tradition of theological murder that continued long after the original family had dispersed. FBI profiles of certain serial killers have noted similarities to Grayson methodologies, though these connections remain classified due to ongoing investigations. The third family that dominated this period of Appalachian criminal history represented yet another approach to organized violence. Where the Pernals manipulated and the Graysons sacrificed, the Caldwell clan of southwestern Virginia perfected what they called economic warfare, using systematic financial destruction to eliminate enemies and accumulate wealth and power. The Caldwells understood something that wouldn't be widely recognized until the development of modern economic theory, that in a cash-poor mountain economy, whoever controlled the flow of money and credit could exercise life and death power over entire communities. They weren't just criminals, they were economic predators who used sophisticated financial manipulation to destroy their enemies while enriching themselves. The family's economic empire began in 1868 when Marcus Caldwell returned from the Civil War with a small amount of gold and an understanding of how financial systems could be manipulated for criminal purposes. Unlike other veterans who used their military experience for traditional forms of banditry, Marcus recognized that theft was inefficient compared to systematic economic manipulation. Marcus established what appeared to be a legitimate banking and lending operation, offering credit to farmers, small business owners, and families struggling to rebuild after the war. His terms seemed reasonable, his interest rates were competitive, and his willingness to lend to high-risk borrowers made him popular throughout the region. What his customers didn't understand was that Marcus was deliberately creating a web of interconnected debt designed to transfer ownership of their property and businesses to Caldwell control. The system worked through carefully coordinated manipulation of local economic conditions. The Caldwells would identify a community or region they wanted to control, then systematically destabilize its economy while positioning themselves as the only available source of relief. They would arrange for key businesses to fail through sabotage or manipulation, create artificial shortages of essential goods, and spread rumors that caused runs on local banks. As economic conditions deteriorated, desperate families and business owners would turn to Marcus Caldwell for emergency loans. These loans came with terms that appeared generous, but contained hidden clauses and conditions that made default almost inevitable. Borrowers would discover that their payment schedules had been miscalculated, that additional fees had been added without explanation, or that their collateral had been revalued downward, increasing their debt burden. When borrowers inevitably defaulted, the Caldwells would seize their property through legal foreclosure proceedings that had been carefully orchestrated in advance. Marcus had cultivated relationships with judges, court clerks, and legal officials throughout the region, ensuring that foreclosure cases would be heard by friendly courts and processed according to predetermined outcomes. The foreclosed properties would then be sold at public auctions that the Caldwells controlled through networks of dummy bidders and shell companies. Properties worth thousands of dollars would be sold for hundreds, always to Caldwell associates, who would then transfer ownership to the family through private transactions. Within months of the initial loan, a family farm or business that had been operated successfully for generations would become part of the Caldwell empire. But the Caldwells' most innovative criminal technique was their systematic manipulation of local commodity markets. They would identify essential goods that communities depended on, then use their growing financial power to corner those markets and create artificial scarcity. During harsh winters, they would control access to firewood and heating coal. During droughts, they would monopolize grain supplies. During economic downturns, they would corner the market on basic necessities like salt, sugar, and coffee. These artificial shortages generated enormous profits while creating additional opportunities for financial manipulation. Families facing starvation would mortgage their property for emergency food supplies. Business owners would accept ruinous credit terms for access to materials they needed to continue operating. Entire communities would become dependent on Caldwell-controlled supply chains that could be manipulated to serve the family's broader strategic goals. The Caldwells also pioneered what modern economists would recognize as predatory insurance practices. They established what appeared to be a legitimate insurance cooperative, offering protection against crop failures, livestock losses, and property damage. Community members who purchased these policies believed they were protecting themselves against catastrophic losses, but the Caldwells were actually creating new opportunities for systematic theft. The insurance policies contained complex terms and conditions that made claim denial almost automatic. More importantly, the Caldwells used their knowledge of who was insured for what to orchestrate the very losses their policies were supposed to protect against. A farmer insured against crop failure might find his fields damaged by mysterious plant diseases. A merchant insured against theft might discover that his store had been burglarized by criminals who seemed to know exactly what goods were covered and which were not. When policyholders attempted to file claims, they would encounter endless bureaucratic delays, demands for impossible documentation, and arbitrary policy interpretations that justified denial of payment. Meanwhile, the Caldwells would offer to purchase the damaged or destroyed property at below-market prices, positioning themselves as helpful neighbors offering assistance during difficult times. The family's financial manipulation extended beyond individual transactions to systematic manipulation of entire local economies. They would identify regions with valuable natural resources, then use coordinated economic pressure to force out existing residents and businesses. Coal deposits, timber stands, and mineral rights that had been owned by mountain families for generations would be transferred to Caldwell control through orchestrated financial crises. Their most audacious scheme involved the manipulation of an entire county's tax system. The Caldwells identified Scott County, Virginia, as a target for comprehensive economic takeover due to its valuable coal deposits and strategic location. They began by establishing friendly relationships with county officials, providing loans and financial assistance that created networks of obligation and dependence. Next, they systematically manipulated property assessments and tax collections to create artificial financial crises for targeted property owners. Families would discover that their properties had been reassessed at dramatically higher values, creating tax burdens they couldn't afford. When they protested, they would be told that the assessments had been conducted according to new state regulations that required more accurate valuations. Unable to pay the inflated taxes, property owners would face foreclosure by the county government. But the Caldwells had arranged for these tax sales to be conducted under conditions that discouraged competitive bidding. Sales would be announced with minimal publicity, scheduled during inconvenient times, and conducted in locations that were difficult for potential bidders to reach. The Caldwells would acquire thousands of acres of valuable property for the cost of unpaid taxes, often purchasing lands worth tens of thousands of dollars for hundreds of dollars in tax debt. Over the course of a decade, they gained control of over 60% of Scott County's land area through this systematic manipulation of the tax system. But their success in Scott County proved to be their downfall. The systematic nature of their property acquisitions attracted attention from state authorities who began investigating irregularities in tax assessments and collection procedures. The investigation revealed a pattern of coordinated fraud involving county officials, property assessors, and tax collectors who had been working with the Caldwells to systematically defraud legitimate property owners. Federal authorities, who took over the investigation, discovered evidence of financial manipulation that extended far beyond Scott County. The Caldwells had been operating similar schemes throughout Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, systematically transferring millions of dollars worth of property from mountain families to their criminal organization. The complexity of their financial crimes made prosecution extremely difficult. Unlike violent crimes that left obvious evidence, the Caldwells' economic manipulation had been conducted through legal channels using legitimate financial instruments. Proving criminal intent required demonstrating that legitimate business practices had been systematically abused as part of a coordinated conspiracy. The legal proceedings against the Caldwell family lasted for over 8 years and established important precedents for prosecution of white-collar crime. For the first time, federal courts recognized that systematic financial manipulation could constitute criminal conspiracy even when individual transactions appeared legitimate. Most of the Caldwell family members eventually received prison sentences, but the sentences were relatively light compared to the scope of their crimes. More importantly, the vast majority of their stolen wealth was never recovered. Properties that had been transferred through their manipulation schemes had been sold to third parties, incorporated into legitimate businesses, or hidden through complex networks of shell companies that investigators couldn't unravel. The Caldwell legacy extends far beyond their criminal careers. Their sophisticated financial manipulation techniques became templates for white-collar crime that continue to be used today. Modern predatory lending practices, systematic mortgage fraud, and complex investment scams all bear similarities to methods pioneered by the Caldwells in the Appalachian Mountains over a century ago. Perhaps more significantly, their systematic economic destruction of mountain communities contributed to patterns of poverty and economic dependence that persist throughout Appalachia today. Families who lost their land to Caldwell manipulation were forced into cycles of tenancy and wage labor that prevented them from rebuilding economic independence. Communities that had their local economies destroyed never fully recovered their previous prosperity. The story of these three families reveals how the isolation and lawlessness of the Appalachian Mountains created conditions where criminal innovation could flourish unchecked. The Pernals perfected psychological manipulation and proxy violence. The Graysons weaponized religious fanaticism. The Caldwells pioneered systematic economic predation. Each family developed criminal methodologies that were decades ahead of their time, creating templates that would later be adopted by more sophisticated criminal organizations. But their stories also reveal the terrible human cost of criminal innovation. Behind the strategic sophistication and methodological advancement lay thousands of individual tragedies. Families destroyed by carefully orchestrated violence, communities torn apart by manipulated conflicts, and entire regions economically devastated by systematic financial predation. The mountains remember these tragedies even when official histories forget them. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where cell towers still can't reach and GPS systems fail, old-timers still speak in whispers about the Pernals, the Graysons, and the Caldwells. They remember that evil can be patient, sophisticated, and systematic. They remember that the greatest criminals aren't always the most violent, but often the most intelligent. And they remember that in the shadows of America's oldest mountains, some forms of human darkness found perfect conditions to evolve into something far more dangerous than simple brutality. Something that challenged every assumption about the nature of crime, justice, and civilization itself. The legacy of these families extends into the present day, not just through their criminal methodologies, but through the institutional knowledge that their existence revealed something fundamental about the relationship between isolation, power, and human depravity. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying truth about the deadliest Appalachian families isn't what they did, but what they taught us about what people are capable of when traditional constraints on behavior simply disappear. The mountains remember everything, even when we try to forget. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the morning mist still clings to ancient ridgelines like secrets too dark to speak, the stories we've uncovered so far represent only the beginning of a much larger truth. The Hatfields, McCoys, Melundians, and Shepherds were just the opening act in a theater of terror that stretched across generations and transformed entire regions into kingdoms ruled by fear. What makes the remaining families on our list truly terrifying isn't just their capacity for violence, but their sophistication. These weren't simple mountain bandits driven by desperation or revenge. They were criminal innovators who developed methodologies so advanced that law enforcement agencies are still studying their techniques today. They understood something that wouldn't be widely recognized until the development of modern organized crime theory, that true power comes not from random brutality, but from systematic control of people, information, and resources. The families we're about to explore operated criminal enterprises that spanned decades, influenced elections, corrupted entire court systems, and left behind legacies that continue to shape Appalachian communities today. Their stories were deliberately suppressed, their methods classified, their victims forgotten. But the mountains keep all records, and today we're opening files that have remained sealed for over a century. These are the stories of families who didn't just break the law, they became the law. Families whose influence reached from the highest peaks of political power to the deepest shafts of abandoned mines. Families whose names still make federal agents nervous when they appear in old case files, because some investigations were never officially closed and some threats were never fully neutralized. The Bramwell Empire stands as perhaps the most politically sophisticated of all Appalachian criminal dynasties. Unlike other mountain families who operated through fear and intimidation, the Bramwells understood that true power flowed through the ballot box, the courthouse, and the corridors of government. Between 1890 and 1954, this family effectively purchased and controlled the entire political structure of McDowell County, West Virginia, creating what federal investigators would later describe as the first true criminal state within the United States. The Bramwell organization began when Confederate veteran Colonel Marcus Bramwell returned from the Civil War with two crucial advantages: a thorough understanding of military logistics and a substantial cache of gold that he claimed was payment for wartime services, but that federal investigators suspected was stolen from Union supply trains. Marcus recognized that the chaotic post-war period presented unprecedented opportunities for those willing to exploit the weakness of traditional authority structures. Rather than establishing himself as a traditional mountain strongman, Marcus chose a different path. He began systematically purchasing influence within the emerging political structure of McDowell County. His method was elegant in its simplicity. Identify ambitious men with political potential, provide them with the financial backing necessary to win elections, then collect on those debts once they were in office. Within a decade, the Bramwell network had placed their candidates in every significant political position in the county. The sheriff, the prosecutor, the county commissioners, the tax assessor, and eventually the state legislative representatives were all either Bramwell family members or men whose political careers had been purchased with Bramwell gold. But Marcus's true genius lay in his understanding of how to make this corruption appear legitimate. Rather than simply buying votes or stuffing ballot boxes, the Bramwells developed what they called influence architecture, a system of interlocking obligations and dependencies that made their control nearly invisible to outside observers. They established what appeared to be legitimate businesses: a bank, a coal company, a construction firm, and a regional newspaper. These enterprises served as fronts for money laundering and bribery distribution, but they also provided genuine services to the community, creating a network of citizens who had economic reasons to support Bramwell candidates, regardless of any criminal activities. The newspaper proved particularly valuable for their operations. The McDowell County Herald, established in 1893, became the primary source of information for voters throughout the region. The Bramwells used their editorial control to shape public opinion, promoting their candidates while systematically destroying the reputations of anyone who opposed their interests. Their technique for character assassination was remarkably sophisticated. Rather than making obviously false accusations, they would investigate their enemies thoroughly, uncovering genuine scandals and embarrassing secrets that could be revealed at strategically chosen moments. A reform candidate might find his business failures from 2 decades earlier suddenly front-page news just weeks before an election. A crusading prosecutor might discover that his personal indiscretions were being discussed in every barbershop and church meeting in the county. What made the Bramwell system particularly effective was its use of legitimate legal mechanisms to accomplish criminal goals. When they wanted to eliminate a business competitor, they didn't burn down his store. Instead, they would have the fire inspector discover code violations, the tax assessor reassess his property at inflated values, and the licensing board find technical violations that required expensive corrections. The target would find himself facing thousands of dollars in unexpected costs and regulatory hurdles that mysteriously didn't affect Bramwell-connected businesses. By 1910, the Bramwell organization had extended its influence beyond McDowell County. They had established relationships with political figures throughout West Virginia and had begun placing their candidates in state-level positions. Marcus's son, Judge William Bramwell, was elected to the West Virginia Supreme Court in 1912, giving the family influence over the state's highest judicial authority. The family's control over McDowell County was so complete that federal authorities didn't fully understand its scope until the 1950s. For over 60 years, the Bramwells had operated what amounted to a private government, collecting taxes through their bank, enforcing laws through their sheriff, and dispensing justice through their judges. Their influence was particularly evident in how they handled opposition. Unlike other criminal families who simply killed their enemies, the Bramwells preferred to destroy them through systematic legal persecution. Reform candidates would find themselves facing tax evasion charges based on creative interpretations of revenue law. Newspaper editors who criticized Bramwell policies would discover that their businesses were suddenly subject to intense regulatory scrutiny. Citizens who complained too loudly about county services would find themselves facing criminal charges for disturbing the peace or public intoxication. The Bramwell organization also pioneered what modern law enforcement recognizes as institutional corruption. They didn't just bribe individual officials, they corrupted entire systems. The county's budget process, for example, was structured so that all major expenditures had to be approved by committees controlled by Bramwell associates. Road construction contracts, school building projects, and public works programs all involved Bramwell-owned companies, charging inflated prices for substandard work. Most disturbing was their control over the judicial system. The Bramwells had effectively purchased justice in McDowell County. Criminal cases involving family members or associates were routinely dismissed on technical grounds. Civil lawsuits against Bramwell businesses were decided in favor of the family regardless of the evidence. Property disputes were resolved according to Bramwell interests rather than legal precedent. The family maintained detailed records of their corruption network, treating it like any other business enterprise. Federal investigators, who finally gained access to Bramwell archives in 1954, discovered ledgers showing systematic bribe payments to over 200 officials across 3 states. Documentation of fixed elections dating back to 1895 and evidence of coordinated criminal conspiracies involving multiple state governments. The Bramwell Empire finally collapsed when they made the mistake of attempting to fix a federal election in 1952. Their standard techniques for controlling local politics proved inadequate when applied to national campaigns, and their heavy-handed manipulation of voting procedures attracted attention from federal authorities who had previously ignored their activities as local corruption. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the Bramwell organization. What had appeared to be isolated incidents of local corruption was actually a coordinated criminal enterprise that had been systematically looting public resources for over half a century. The family had stolen an estimated $40 million from county and state governments through inflated contracts, fraudulent land deals, and systematic tax evasion. The trials that followed established important legal precedents for prosecution of political corruption. For the first time, federal courts recognized that systematic bribery of government officials could constitute conspiracy to defraud the United States, opening the door for federal prosecution of local corruption schemes. Most of the Bramwell family members received substantial prison sentences, but the damage to democratic institutions in their region proved lasting. Generations of voters had been conditioned to expect corruption as normal, and many of the systems they had established continued to function long after their creators were imprisoned. Even today, political scientists studying Appalachian governance point to McDowell County as an example of how criminal organizations can effectively capture and control democratic institutions. The Bramwell model has been studied by law enforcement agencies investigating political corruption around the world, and their techniques for systematic institutional capture continue to influence modern organized crime operations. Moving deeper into the criminal underground of Appalachian history, we encounter the Dunbar clan of eastern Tennessee, a family whose specialty was what they called the long game. Unlike other criminal organizations that sought immediate profits through violence or theft, the Dunbars developed a multi-generational strategy for accumulating wealth and power that spanned over a century and involved some of the most sophisticated financial manipulation in American criminal history. The Dunbar criminal empire began in 1868 when Jeremiah Dunbar, a former bank clerk who had fled embezzlement charges in Philadelphia, arrived in the remote mountains of Sevier County with nothing but a small bag of gold coins and an encyclopedic knowledge of financial systems. Jeremiah understood something that most mountain criminals never grasped, that patience and compound growth could generate far more wealth than any amount of robbery or extortion. Jeremiah's first move was to establish what appeared to be a legitimate banking operation in the small town of Gatlinburg. The Sevier County Bank offered standard services, business loans, personal credit, and secure storage for valuables. What made it different was Jeremiah's extraordinary ability to identify and exploit opportunities that other bankers missed or considered too risky. The secret to Jeremiah's success lay in his understanding of information asymmetries. In an era before telegraph lines reached remote mountain communities, the Dunbars developed an extensive network of couriers and informants that allowed them to learn about economic opportunities days or weeks before their competitors. They knew about railroad construction projects before the companies announced them, learned about mineral discoveries before surveys were completed, and received advance warning of government land sales before notices were published. This information advantage allowed the Dunbars to make investments that appeared impossibly prescient to outside observers. They would purchase seemingly worthless mountain land just months before railroad companies announced plans to build through those exact locations. They would establish lumber operations in areas where other companies had found nothing valuable, only to discover rich timber stands that previous surveys had somehow missed. But Jeremiah's true innovation was what he called generational wealth transfer, a system for moving money through time and across family lines in ways that made it nearly impossible for authorities to track. The Dunbars didn't just accumulate wealth, they created multiple parallel financial identities that could hold assets independently of each other. Each generation of Dunbars would establish new banks, investment companies, and trading operations under different family names. These entities would do business with each other in complex webs of transactions that served to launder money while creating legitimate business records. A coal mine owned by one Dunbar company would sell its product to a railroad owned by another Dunbar entity, which would transport goods for a shipping company controlled by a third branch of the family. The beauty of this system was that each individual transaction appeared completely legitimate. Government investigators would find proper contracts, accurate financial records, and evidence of genuine business relationships. What they couldn't see was the underlying coordination that ensured all profits ultimately flowed to Dunbar control. The family also pioneered techniques for manipulating property records and legal documents that wouldn't be widely understood until the development of modern white-collar crime investigation. They maintained relationships with corrupt courthouse clerks, land surveyors, and legal officials who could create, modify, or destroy documents according to Dunbar needs. When the family wanted to acquire a particular piece of property, they wouldn't simply make an offer to purchase. Instead, they would research the property's legal history, identify any ambiguities or errors in previous transactions, then use their legal connections to challenge the current owner's title. Property disputes that should have been resolved in favor of legitimate owners would drag on for years, while mounting legal costs forced families to sell their land at below-market prices to pay their attorney fees. The Dunbars would then purchase these properties through shell companies, using their legal contacts to ensure that their own titles were properly recorded and legally sound. Over decades, they assembled vast holdings of valuable land throughout eastern Tennessee, much of it acquired through systematic legal manipulation rather than honest purchase. Their most audacious scheme involved the manipulation of inheritance laws and probate procedures. The Dunbars identified elderly property owners with valuable holdings but complicated family situations. They would then insert themselves into inheritance disputes, often by lending money to potential heirs or purchasing claims from distant relatives. When the property owner died, the resulting probate proceedings would become exercises in legal chaos. Multiple parties would claim ownership of the same property, each represented by attorneys who were secretly working for the Dunbars. The disputes would continue for years, with mounting legal costs and court fees that had to be paid from the estate's assets. Eventually, the only party with sufficient resources to satisfy all creditors and resolve the legal complications would be Dunbar-controlled entities. They would purchase the disputed properties for fractions of their actual value, having manufactured the legal problems that made normal sales impossible. The federal government first became aware of the Dunbar operations during World War I, when the family's extensive land holdings began to interfere with military construction projects. Government surveyors found that much of the land needed for training facilities and supply depots was controlled by a maze of interconnected companies that all traced back to Dunbar ownership. The investigation that followed revealed a level of financial sophistication that astonished federal attorneys. The Dunbars had created what amounted to a parallel banking system throughout eastern Tennessee, with dozens of financial institutions that appeared independent but were actually components of a single criminal enterprise. More disturbing was the discovery that the family had been systematically manipulating local tax assessments and collection procedures for over 40 years. They had placed their associates in key positions within county tax offices, allowing them to undervalue their own properties while inflating assessments on lands they wanted to acquire through tax sales. The complexity of their financial manipulations made prosecution extremely difficult. Federal investigators found themselves trying to untangle business relationships that spanned multiple generations and involved hundreds of seemingly legitimate transactions. Each thread they followed led to new discoveries of additional fraud, but proving criminal intent required demonstrating coordination between entities that maintained separate books and appeared to operate independently. The Dunbar trials of 1923 to 1925 established important legal precedents for prosecution of complex financial crimes. For the first time, federal courts recognized that systematic manipulation of legal and financial systems could constitute criminal conspiracy, even when individual actions appeared legitimate. The family's downfall came when they attempted to expand their operations beyond the Appalachian region. Their techniques for manipulating local officials and legal systems proved ineffective in major urban areas where oversight was more stringent and corruption was more difficult to establish. A failed attempt to corner the cotton market in Memphis exposed their financial manipulations to scrutiny from federal banking regulators who had the resources to conduct comprehensive investigations. Most of the Dunbar family members received substantial prison sentences, but the wealth they had accumulated over decades proved impossible to recover. Their assets had been distributed across so many entities and jurisdictions that federal authorities were never able to identify more than a fraction of their holdings. The Dunbar legacy extends far beyond their individual crimes. Their techniques for systematic financial manipulation became templates for organized crime operations that continue to operate today. Modern money laundering schemes, complex investment fraud, and systematic tax evasion all bear similarities to methods pioneered by the Dunbars in the Tennessee mountains over a century ago. Perhaps more significantly, their systematic corruption of legal and financial institutions contributed to a culture of institutional distrust that persists throughout Appalachia today. Communities that were victimized by Dunbar manipulations developed deep suspicion of banks, government agencies, and legal authorities that continues to influence regional attitudes toward institutional power. The third family that dominated this era of Appalachian criminal innovation was the Morrison clan of southwestern Virginia, whose specialty was what they called social engineering. Unlike other criminal families who relied on violence or financial manipulation, the Morrisons understood that the most powerful weapon in any criminal arsenal was the ability to control how people thought, felt, and behaved. The Morrison criminal empire began in 1875 when Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, a former Confederate Army surgeon who had been discharged for conducting unauthorized medical experiments on wounded soldiers, established a medical practice in the remote Blue Ridge Mountains. Ezekiel brought with him not only medical training, but also a twisted understanding of human psychology that he had developed through his wartime experiments. Unlike other mountain doctors who focused on treating injuries and the illnesses, Ezekiel was fascinated by the human mind and its vulnerability to manipulation. He began conducting what he called therapeutic research on his patients, using his medical authority to experiment with drugs, hypnosis, and psychological conditioning techniques that were decades ahead of their time. Ezekiel's first discovery was that people in isolated mountain communities were particularly susceptible to suggestion and group pressure. The combination of limited education, strong religious beliefs, and close-knit social structures created conditions where a respected authority figure could exercise enormous influence over individual behavior and community decisions. He began developing techniques for what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic manipulation of cognitive biases and emotional vulnerabilities. Ezekiel understood that people made decisions based on emotion rather than logic, and that by controlling emotional states, he could effectively control behavior. His method involved carefully studying each patient and community member to identify their deepest fears, desires, and insecurities. He would then use this psychological intelligence to craft personalized approaches that could convince people to act against their own interests while believing they were making rational decisions. For example, when Ezekiel wanted to acquire a patient's property, he wouldn't simply make an offer to purchase. Instead, he would spend months or years conditioning the family to associate their land with negative experiences. He might suggest during medical visits that certain areas of their property were unhealthy, causing mysterious illnesses that only he could treat. He would gradually convince them that their financial difficulties were caused by remaining on cursed land, and that their only hope for prosperity lay in selling and moving elsewhere. The conditioning process was so subtle that families would eventually approach Ezekiel, begging him to purchase their property to save them from the disasters he had convinced them were imminent. They would sell valuable land for far below market value, genuinely grateful to the doctor who was rescuing them from problems that existed only in their manipulated perceptions. Ezekiel's psychological techniques proved remarkably effective, and he began training his children in what he called the science of human engineering. Each child specialized in different aspects of manipulation. One became expert at exploiting religious beliefs, another focused on financial anxieties, a third specialized in romantic and family relationships. By the 1890s, the Morrison family had effectively gained control over several mountain communities through systematic psychological manipulation. They held no official positions and owned no major businesses, but they exercised more real power than any elected official or traditional authority figure. Their control operated through what they called influence networks, webs of psychologically dependent individuals who unknowingly served Morrison interests while believing they were acting according to their own free will. A shopkeeper might find himself consistently undercharging Morrison associates without understanding why. A banker might approve loans for Morrison projects while rejecting similar applications from others. A sheriff might consistently fail to investigate crimes that involved Morrison interests. The Morrisons also developed techniques for manipulating group dynamics and community decision-making processes. They understood that public opinion could be shaped through careful management of information flow and social pressure. They would identify opinion leaders within communities, then use personalized psychological approaches to influence these key individuals, knowing that their influence would spread throughout their social networks. Their most sophisticated operation involved what they called manufactured controversies. The Morrisons would deliberately create conflicts between different factions within a community, then position themselves as neutral mediators who could resolve the disputes. The resolution process would always result in outcomes that served Morrison interests, but the communities involved would be grateful for their intervention. For instance, they might secretly spread rumors about a planned railroad that would benefit some landowners while destroying others' property values. As tensions escalated between different groups, the Morrisons would offer to mediate, eventually proposing compromises that required selling disputed land to Morrison-controlled entities at below-market prices. Both sides would feel they had been treated fairly, never realizing that the entire conflict had been artificially created to serve Morrison interests. The family's psychological manipulation techniques extended to law enforcement and judicial proceedings. They developed methods for influencing jury selection, manipulating witness testimony, and shaping judge and prosecutor decision-making that were far more sophisticated than simple bribery. Rather than paying officials to ignore their crimes, the Morrisons would use psychological conditioning to convince law enforcement personnel that investigating Morrison activities was unnecessary, unproductive, or potentially dangerous to their careers. They would gradually build relationships with key officials, providing them with information about other crimes while subtly discouraging interest in Morrison-related activities. Their techniques for manipulating legal proceedings were particularly sophisticated. They would conduct extensive psychological profiles of potential jurors, then use jury selection processes to ensure panels composed of individuals who were susceptible to specific types of emotional manipulation. During trials, they would coordinate witness testimony and evidence presentation to exploit known cognitive biases and emotional triggers. The Morrisons also pioneered techniques for manipulating media coverage and public opinion that wouldn't be widely understood until the development of modern propaganda theory. They understood that people's perceptions of events were often more important than the events themselves, and that by controlling how information was presented, they could effectively control reality for most observers. They maintained relationships with newspaper editors and reporters throughout the region, not through bribery, but through psychological conditioning that made these media figures genuinely believe that Morrison-favorable coverage served the public interest. Critical stories about Morrison activities were rare, and when they did appear, they were quickly followed by contradictory information that created confusion rather than clarity. The family's downfall began in 1931 when they attempted to manipulate federal prohibition agents who were investigating moonshine operations in their territory. Their psychological techniques, which had proven effective against local officials and isolated mountain communities, were inadequate against trained federal agents who had experience with sophisticated criminal organizations. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Morrison's psychological manipulation techniques. Federal agents discovered detailed files containing psychological profiles of hundreds of individuals, manipulation strategies tailored to specific personality types, and evidence of systematic conditioning operations that had been ongoing for decades. What made the Morrison case particularly disturbing to federal investigators was the realization that many of their victims continued to defend the family even after learning about their manipulation. The psychological conditioning had been so thorough that victims often refused to believe evidence of their own exploitation, preferring to maintain their manipulated worldview rather than confront the reality of their victimization. The Morrison trials of 1933 to 1935 established important legal precedents for prosecution of psychological manipulation and fraud. For the first time, federal courts recognized that systematic manipulation of human psychology could constitute criminal conspiracy, even when victims technically consented to the actions that harmed them. The family's conviction required prosecutors to develop new approaches to demonstrating criminal intent in cases involving psychological manipulation. They had to prove that the Morrisons had deliberately exploited psychological vulnerabilities, rather than simply being persuasive or charismatic individuals who succeeded through legitimate influence. Most of the Morrison family members received substantial prison sentences, but their techniques for psychological manipulation continued to influence criminal organizations long after their conviction. Modern cult leaders, confidence artists, and white-collar criminals still use methods pioneered by the Morrisons in the Virginia mountains over a century ago. Perhaps most significantly, the Morrison legacy revealed how vulnerable democratic institutions and community decision-making processes could be to systematic psychological manipulation. Their techniques for controlling public opinion and influencing group behavior provided blueprints for political manipulation that continue to be studied by both law enforcement agencies and political scientists today. The final family that completes our exploration of Appalachian criminal dynasties represents perhaps the most chilling example of how isolation and lawlessness could transform human beings into something beyond recognition. The Kestrel clan of eastern Kentucky didn't just commit crimes, they evolved beyond conventional humanity into something that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilization, morality, and the nature of evil itself. The Kestrel story begins in 1882 when a family of 7 disappeared from their homestead near the headwaters of the Kentucky River. Search parties found no trace of violence, no evidence of struggle, and no indication of where they might have gone. What they did find was a series of symbols carved into trees around the property, markings that resembled no known writing system and seemed to have been made with tools that left no conventional cut marks. For months, the disappearance remained a local mystery, until reports began emerging of a family living deep in the most remote sections of the Daniel Boone National Forest, people who matched the description of the missing family, but who had somehow changed in ways that witnesses struggled to describe. Those who claimed to have seen them spoke of movements that seemed too fluid for human anatomy, of voices that carried farther than should have been possible, and of eyes that reflected light in the darkness, like those of nocturnal animals. The truth about the Kestrels didn't emerge until federal investigators began studying reports of systematic disappearances throughout eastern Kentucky during the early 1900s. What they discovered was evidence of a family that had abandoned conventional human society entirely, developing survival strategies and behavioral patterns that placed them outside any recognized category of criminal organization. The Kestrels had become what anthropologists would later term feral humans, people who had reverted to pre-civilized behavioral patterns while retaining human intelligence and the ability to use tools. But their transformation went beyond simple reversion to primitive lifestyles. They had developed new forms of predatory behavior that combined human intelligence with animal instincts in ways that made them uniquely dangerous. Unlike other criminal families who maintained some connection to civilized society, the Kestrels had severed all ties to human community. They lived entirely off the land, moving through the forest in patterns that suggested territorial behavior similar to large predators. They established no permanent settlements, built no structures, and left no traces of their presence except for the occasional discovery of symbols carved into trees or stones. The Kestrels' hunting patterns became the subject of extensive study by federal investigators who tried to understand how they selected and captured their victims. Unlike conventional criminals who targeted victims for specific resources or advantages, the Kestrels seemed to choose people based on criteria that investigators could never fully decipher. Their victims were always individuals who had ventured into remote forest areas alone, hunters, surveyors, prospectors, and travelers who had strayed from established trails. The disappearances followed consistent patterns that suggested careful observation and planning. Victims would be tracked for days or weeks before being taken, their routines studied, their weaknesses identified. What made the Kestrels particularly terrifying was their apparent ability to predict and exploit human behavior with supernatural accuracy. They seemed to understand exactly how their victims would react to specific stimuli, allowing them to manipulate people into making decisions that place them in vulnerable positions. Survivors of Kestrel encounters, rare as they were, described experiences that challenged rational explanation. They spoke of being stalked through the forest by shapes that moved through trees without disturbing branches, of hearing voices that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, of finding their equipment mysteriously rearranged in ways that created psychological pressure. The family's technique for isolating victims involved what investigators came to call psychological herding. They would use sounds, movements, and environmental manipulation to gradually separate individuals from groups, creating situations where people made decisions that seemed logical but ultimately led them away from safety and into Kestrel territory. Federal agents who attempted to track the Kestrels in their forest territory reported experiences that bordered on supernatural. Compasses would malfunction, maps would prove inaccurate, and familiar landmarks would appear in wrong locations. Search teams would find themselves walking in circles despite having trained navigation specialists, and equipment would fail in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage. The Kestrels also demonstrated an understanding of modern technology that was remarkable given their apparent abandonment of civilized society. They seemed to know exactly how to disable vehicles, communication equipment, and weapons in ways that left no obvious evidence of tampering. Federal agents would find their radios silent, their vehicles immobilized, and their firearms jammed, often with no clear explanation for the failures. Most disturbing were reports of Kestrel psychological warfare techniques. They would leave behind evidence of their presence designed to create maximum psychological impact. Personal items from previous victims, arranged in threatening patterns, symbols carved into surfaces where their enemies would find them, and sounds produced at night that were calculated to prevent sleep and induce paranoia. The family's territorial behavior followed patterns that suggested they had developed their own complex social structure and communication systems. Different sections of the forest showed evidence of different Kestrel activities, areas where they processed victims, locations where they stored equipment taken from their targets, and sites where they conducted what appeared to be ritualistic activities involving human remains. Federal investigators eventually identified at least 12 distinct kestrel individuals, though their exact relationship to the original missing family remained unclear. Some appeared to be the original family members, while others might have been victims who had been somehow transformed or converted to kestrel society. The family's criminal activities extended beyond simple murder and robbery. They had developed sophisticated techniques for psychological torture that involved keeping victims alive for extended periods while subjecting them to experiences designed to break their mental resistance. Survivors of these experiences, when they were found, required extensive psychiatric treatment and often never fully recovered their previous mental state. The kestrels also practiced what investigators termed identity harvesting, taking personal items, clothing, and documents from their victims and using them in ways that suggested they were studying and mimicking human behavior. They seemed to be learning how to impersonate their victims, possibly to allow them to move through civilized society when necessary. The federal campaign against the kestrels lasted from 1925 to 1943 and involved some of the most extensive manhunts in American law enforcement history. Multiple agencies contributed resources to tracking and apprehending family members, but the operation proved extraordinarily difficult due to their intimate knowledge of forest terrain and their apparent ability to anticipate law enforcement tactics. The final confrontation occurred in 1943 when federal agents, supported by military personnel, conducted a coordinated assault on what they had identified as the primary kestrel territory. The operation involved over 300 agents and soldiers equipped with the latest military technology, including radio communication systems and aerial reconnaissance capabilities. Even with overwhelming numbers and superior equipment, the campaign against the kestrels proved costly. 7 federal agents and 3 soldiers were killed during the operation, and many more were injured or psychologically traumatized by their encounters with family members. The kestrels demonstrated combat capabilities that seemed to combine human intelligence with animal ferocity and environmental adaptation. The operation officially ended when federal forces discovered evidence suggesting that the remaining kestrel family members had been killed in a final confrontation deep in the forest. However, the bodies were never recovered, and many investigators remained convinced that some family members had escaped to continue their activities in other locations. Evidence supporting this theory emerged in subsequent decades as reports of similar disappearances and unexplained phenomena appeared in other remote forest areas throughout Appalachia. Law enforcement agencies documented cases in North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia that bore striking similarities to kestrel activities, suggesting that either surviving family members or individuals inspired by their methods continued to operate throughout the region. The kestrel case files remained classified for decades due to concerns that public knowledge of their activities might inspire copycat crimes or create panic in rural communities. When portions of the files were finally declassified in the 1980s, they revealed the most disturbing chapter in the history of American criminal activity. The legacy of the kestrel family extends far beyond their individual crimes. Their case forced law enforcement agencies to develop new approaches to tracking criminals who operated outside conventional social structures and their psychological warfare techniques influenced military and intelligence training programs that continue to this day. Perhaps most significantly, the Kestrel story revealed how completely human beings could abandon civilized behavior while retaining the intelligence and adaptability that made them uniquely dangerous. Their transformation from ordinary mountain family to something resembling organized predators challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the effectiveness of traditional law enforcement methods. The mountains of Appalachia have now revealed their darkest secrets, stories of families whose crimes transcended simple violence and entered realms that challenge our understanding of human capacity for evil. From the political manipulation of the Bramwells to the financial sophistication of the Dunbars, from the psychological warfare of the Morrisons to the feral transformation of the Kestrels, these families represented the evolution of criminal behavior under conditions where traditional constraints on human conduct simply ceased to exist. What makes these stories truly terrifying isn't just their historical significance, but their continuing relevance. The techniques developed by these Appalachian criminal dynasties provided templates for organized crime, political corruption, financial fraud, and psychological manipulation that continue to influence criminal behavior today. Modern law enforcement agencies still study their methods, and elements of their approaches can be recognized in contemporary criminal organizations around the world. The isolation of the Appalachian Mountains created laboratory conditions where criminal innovation could flourish unchecked for decades. Without effective law enforcement, reliable communication, or strong institutional oversight, these families were free to develop and refine approaches to criminal activity that would have been impossible in more civilized regions. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of these families is what they revealed about the fragility of civilization itself. Under the right conditions, with sufficient isolation and freedom from consequences, ordinary human beings proved capable of transforming into something far more dangerous than simple criminals. They became innovators of evil, pioneers of techniques for manipulating, exploiting, and destroying their fellow human beings that challenged every assumption about human nature and social order. The mountains remember everything, and the lessons learned from these criminal dynasties continue to echo through the hollows and ridges of Appalachia. In the deepest valleys, where cell towers still cannot reach and GPS systems fail, old-timers still speak in whispers about the families whose names should never be spoken aloud. They remember that some forms of human darkness, once unleashed, never truly disappear. The stories we've uncovered today aren't just historical curiosities or examples of regional folklore. They're warnings about what human beings are capable of when the normal restraints of civilization are removed. They remind us that beneath the veneer of modern society lies the same capacity for innovation in evil that transformed simple mountain families into criminal dynasties whose influence extended far beyond their mountain territories. In the end, the deadliest Appalachian families weren't just products of their time and place. They were harbingers of criminal sophistication that wouldn't be widely recognized until decades later, pioneers of techniques that continue to challenge law enforcement and threaten communities today. Their legacy lives on, not just in the mountains where they once ruled, but in the ongoing struggle between those who would exploit human weakness and those who work to protect society from the darkness that dwells within us all. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also preserve their warnings. And in an age where technology and globalization have created new opportunities for those who would prey upon their fellow human beings, perhaps it's time we listened more carefully to what the shadows of Appalachia have been trying to tell us all along. The mountains held their breath as federal agents prepared for what would become the largest law enforcement operation in Appalachian history. What they discovered in those final raids would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of evil itself. By 1954, the criminal dynasties we've explored had pushed beyond simple lawlessness into realms that defied conventional understanding. But their reign of terror was about to face its ultimate test. The coordinated federal response began with Operation Mountain Sweep, a classified initiative that brought together resources from the FBI, federal marshals, and military intelligence units. What made this operation unprecedented wasn't just its scope, but the acknowledgement by federal authorities that they were dealing with criminal organizations unlike anything previously encountered in American law enforcement. The operation targeted 7 remaining criminal strongholds simultaneously, using tactics borrowed from military siege warfare rather than conventional police procedures. Federal planners had learned from decades of failed investigations that traditional law enforcement methods were inadequate against families who had evolved their own forms of governance, justice, and territorial control. But even as federal forces closed in on their targets, the most dangerous family on our list was already preparing for their final, most horrifying demonstration of power. The Crane family of eastern Tennessee had been watching, waiting, and planning for this moment for over 30 years. The Crane dynasty represented the absolute pinnacle of Appalachian criminal evolution. Unlike other families who specialized in violence, manipulation, or financial crimes, the Cranes had transcended conventional criminality entirely. They had become something that challenged the very foundations of human civilization, a family that had learned to weaponize reality itself. The Crane criminal empire began in 1922 when Dr. Elias Crane, a disgraced psychiatrist fleeing malpractice charges in Chicago, established what he called a therapeutic community in the most remote section of the Cherokee National Forest. Crane had been experimenting with what he termed collective consciousness manipulation, techniques for altering group perception and behavior that were decades ahead of anything being studied in legitimate psychology. But Elias Crane's experiments went far beyond academic research. He had discovered something in the isolated mountain environment that amplified his psychological manipulation techniques beyond anything he had achieved in urban settings. The combination of geographic isolation, close-knit family structures, and the unique electromagnetic properties of the mountain environment created conditions where reality itself seemed malleable to those who understood how to exploit it. The Crane family's signature ability was what they called consensus reality manipulation. They could convince entire communities that events had occurred that never actually happened, that people existed who were figments of imagination, and that established facts were false memories implanted by outside authorities. Their technique involved systematic psychological conditioning combined with what appeared to be supernatural influence over local environmental conditions. The Cranes would identify a target community, then begin a carefully orchestrated campaign to destabilize the residents' confidence in their own perceptions and memories. The process began with subtle environmental manipulation. The Cranes had learned to trigger localized weather phenomena, create optical illusions using natural atmospheric conditions, and produce sounds that seem to come from impossible directions. These environmental effects were always just barely outside the range of normal experience, enough to create doubt, but not obvious enough to be dismissed as supernatural. Simultaneously, the family would infiltrate the target community through seemingly innocent social contacts. Crane family members were master actors who could assume any personality or background necessary to gain trust and access to their targets. They would establish themselves as helpful neighbors, respected community members, and trusted confidants. Once they had gained acceptance, the Cranes would begin the psychological phase of their operation. They would gradually introduce conflicting information about past events, question the accuracy of their targets' memories, and suggest alternative explanations for established facts. The process was so subtle that victims rarely realized their perceptions were being systematically altered. But the Cranes' most terrifying ability was their apparent capacity to create shared hallucinations that affected entire groups simultaneously. Witnesses reported experiencing identical visions, hearing the same impossible sounds, and observing events that later investigation proved could not have occurred. Federal investigators who studied Crane activities discovered evidence of mass psychological manipulation that defied scientific explanation. Entire communities would develop false memories of historical events, shared delusions about the presence of non-existent people, and collective amnesia about actual occurrences that had been witnessed by hundreds of individuals. The Cranes used these abilities to establish absolute control over the territories they claimed. They would convince local law enforcement that federal agents were imposters, persuade bank officials that legitimate property owners were fraudsters, and create community-wide beliefs that anyone who opposed Crane interests was suffering from mental illness or criminal influence. Most disturbing was their practice of reality harvesting, where they would systematically erase inconvenient truths from community consciousness while implanting false memories that served their purposes. Property ownership records would be forgotten, criminal activities would be remembered as legitimate business, and victims of Crane violence would be recalled as people who had never existed. The family maintained detailed records of their psychological operations, treating reality manipulation as a precise science. Federal agents who finally gained access to Crane archives discovered thousands of pages documenting techniques for mass hypnosis, collective memory alteration, and what they called consensus reality engineering. These documents revealed that the Cranes had been conducting what amounted to large-scale psychological experiments on human populations for over 3 decades. They had developed methodologies for controlling group behavior that wouldn't be understood by mainstream psychology until decades later. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery that the Cranes' techniques had been spreading. Federal investigators found evidence that other criminal families throughout Appalachia had been learning and adapting Crane methods, creating a network of reality manipulators who could alter perception and memory across vast regions. The final confrontation with the Crane family occurred in November 1954, when federal forces surrounded their compound during what intelligence indicated was a major family gathering. What happened next would be classified for over 40 years and still remains partially redacted in declassified documents. According to the available records, as federal agents approached the Crane compound, they encountered what can only be described as a breakdown of normal physical reality. Agents reported that their equipment began malfunctioning in impossible ways, that the landscape itself seemed to shift and change around them, and that they began experiencing shared hallucinations that made coordinated action nearly impossible. Radio communications filled with reports of agents seeing things that weren't there, of familiar landmarks appearing in wrong locations, and of time itself seeming to move differently within the Crane territory. Several agents reported aging years in what seemed like minutes, while others claimed to experience the same hour repeatedly. The official report states that the Crane compound was found abandoned, with evidence suggesting the family had fled days earlier. But classified addendums reveal a different story. According to these documents, federal agents discovered the compound in a state that defied rational explanation. Buildings appeared to exist in multiple states simultaneously, sometimes solid and sometimes translucent. Rooms were found that were larger inside than the buildings that contained them. Most disturbing were the photographs taken during the raid. These images, when developed, showed not the compound that agents remembered exploring, but entirely different structures in impossible architectural styles. Some photographs contained images of people who weren't present during the raid, including several individuals who had been reported missing from surrounding communities over the previous decades. The aftermath of the Crane raid was classified immediately, with all participating agents subjected to extensive psychological evaluation and sworn to secrecy. Many reported persistent difficulties with memory and perception that lasted for months after their exposure to Crane territory. But the Crane family's final demonstration of power wasn't their escape from federal forces. In the weeks following the raid, communities throughout eastern Tennessee began experiencing what can only be described as reality storms. Entire towns would wake up with shared memories of events that had never occurred. Historical records would be found altered in ways that suggested they had always contained different information. Most terrifyingly, people began disappearing not just physically, but from memory and record. Families would discover empty bedrooms and realize they couldn't remember who had lived there. Communities would find unused buildings and be unable to recall their original purpose. It was as if the Cranes were systematically erasing evidence of their existence while creating false histories to replace the truth. The federal investigation into Crane activities continued for over a decade, but agents found themselves fighting an enemy that could alter the very evidence they were trying to collect. Witnesses would forget what they had seen, documents would be found changed, and investigators would discover that their own memories of previous findings had been altered. The case was finally closed in 1967, not because it was solved, but because continuing the investigation was deemed too dangerous to the mental health of federal personnel. The official conclusion stated that the Crane family had been successfully dispersed and no longer posed a threat to public safety. But classified reports from the following decades suggest otherwise. Similar reality manipulation phenomena have been documented in dozens of locations across the United States, always in isolated areas where small communities report shared false memories, altered historical records, and the mysterious disappearance of people who seem to be forgotten by everyone who knew them. The final entry in the Crane case file, written by the last federal agent assigned to the investigation, provides a chilling assessment of what the family represented. The Cranes didn't just commit crimes against individuals or communities. They committed crimes against reality itself. They proved that truth, memory, and even existence can be weapons in the hands of those who understand how to use them. We may have scattered this particular family, but we never learned how to counter their techniques. Somewhere out there, someone is still editing reality, and we don't even know what we've forgotten. The story of the 9 deadliest Appalachian families reveals more than just a catalog of historical crimes. It demonstrates how isolation, desperation, and the absence of effective authority can create conditions where human beings evolve beyond conventional morality into something far more dangerous than simple criminals. Each family we've explored represents a different form of criminal evolution. The Hatfields and McCoys showed how family loyalty could be weaponized into generational warfare. The Melundians demonstrated how cultural isolation could breed practices that challenged conventional understanding of human behavior. The Shepherds proved that military tactics could be adapted for criminal purposes with devastating effectiveness. The Pernals mastered psychological manipulation decades before it became recognized as a legitimate field of study. The Graysons weaponized religious belief in ways that made their violence seem divinely sanctioned. The Caldwells pioneered economic warfare techniques that wouldn't be widely understood until the development of modern white-collar crime prosecution. The Bramwells showed how democratic institutions could be purchased and controlled by criminal organizations. The Dunbars developed financial manipulation techniques that were so sophisticated they're still studied by law enforcement agencies today. The Morrisons proved that human psychology could be systematically exploited to control behavior and decision-making. And the Cranes transcended all previous criminal innovation by learning to manipulate reality itself, demonstrating that the ultimate weapon isn't violence or money or influence, but control over truth and memory. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of these families isn't their individual crimes, but what they taught us about human potential for evil. Under the right conditions, with sufficient isolation and freedom from consequences, ordinary people proved capable of innovations in cruelty and manipulation that challenged every assumption about human nature and social order. The techniques developed by these Appalachian criminal dynasties didn't disappear when their creators were finally scattered or destroyed. They were preserved, passed down, and adapted by new generations of criminals who understood that the greatest advantages come not from superior firepower or resources, but from superior understanding of human weakness and social vulnerability. Modern organized crime, political corruption, financial fraud, and psychological manipulation all bear the fingerprints of methods pioneered in the isolated mountains of Appalachia over a century ago. The families we've studied were criminal innovators whose influence extends far beyond their mountain territories and far beyond their historical time period. Today, in an age of global communication and surveillance technology, it's tempting to believe that such criminal dynasties could never again flourish in isolation. But the Appalachian Mountains continue to harbor secrets that technology cannot penetrate and authorities cannot access. Deep in the most remote hollows, where cell signals fail and satellite images show only endless forest canopy, there are still places where the old ways persist. Places where certain family names are spoken only in whispers, where certain territories are avoided even by experienced hunters and hikers, where the mountains themselves seem to remember the violence and innovation that once flourished in their shadows. The 9 deadliest Appalachian families may be gone, but their legacy lives on in the techniques they developed, the institutions they corrupted, and the communities they forever changed. They proved that evil, like any other human endeavor, can be studied, refined, and perfected by those willing to abandon conventional moral constraints. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying truth about these criminal dynasties isn't what they did, but what they revealed about what people are capable of doing when traditional social controls break down. They showed us that civilization is far more fragile than we want to believe, and that human beings possess capacities for innovation in evil that match their capacity for innovation in good. The mountains remember everything, including the lessons these families taught about the dark potential that lurks within human nature. And in an increasingly divided and polarized world, where social institutions face growing challenges and traditional authorities struggle to maintain legitimacy, perhaps it's time we paid closer attention to what the shadows of Appalachia have been trying to warn us about all along. The deadliest Appalachian families are gone, but the conditions that created them persist, wherever isolation, desperation, and the absence of effective justice create opportunities for those willing to explore the darker possibilities of human innovation. Their stories aren't just historical curiosities, they're warnings about what we might become when the normal constraints on human behavior simply disappear. The Appalachian Mountains stretched endlessly into the mist, their ancient ridges holding secrets that federal authorities had spent decades trying to bury. But in the winter of 1954, those secrets were about to spill into the light with consequences that would shake the very foundations of American law enforcement. Operation Mountain Sweep had been 3 years in the planning, bringing together resources from agencies that rarely cooperated. FBI behavioral analysts, federal marshals with decades of experience, and military intelligence specialists who understood that they weren't just hunting criminals, they were confronting something that had evolved beyond conventional criminal behavior entirely. The final targets represented the most dangerous evolution of Appalachian criminal dynasties, families who had transcended simple violence and manipulation to become something that challenged the very nature of reality itself. But as federal forces prepared for what they believed would be decisive raids, none of them understood that they were about to face an enemy that could rewrite the rules of engagement in ways that defied every assumption about the possible. The morning of November 15th, 1954, would later be remembered by surviving federal agents as the day they learned that some forms of human evil had evolved so far beyond conventional understanding that traditional law enforcement methods weren't just inadequate, they were laughably primitive. Agent Harrison Mills had spent 15 years investigating organized crime, from the Chicago syndicates to the New York families. He thought he had seen every form of criminal sophistication that human beings could devise. But as his team approached the final target location in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by forests that seemed to absorb sound and light in unnatural ways, he began to understand that everything he thought he knew about criminal behavior was about to be proven inadequate. The Ashford family of eastern Kentucky represented the absolute pinnacle of criminal evolution. For over a century, they had been developing techniques that went beyond psychological manipulation, beyond financial control, beyond even the reality manipulation of families like the Cranes. The Ashfords had learned to weaponize consciousness itself, to alter not just perception and memory, but the fundamental structure of awareness and identity. What made the Ashfords uniquely terrifying wasn't their capacity for violence, though they were certainly capable of extraordinary brutality. It wasn't their sophistication, though their methods were decades ahead of anything law enforcement had encountered. What made them truly dangerous was their apparent ability to exist in multiple states of reality simultaneously, to be present and absent, alive and dead, human and something else entirely, all at the same time. Federal surveillance of Ashford territory had revealed phenomena that challenged scientific understanding. Agents would observe family members in multiple locations simultaneously, engaging in different activities while maintaining what appeared to be full consciousness and purposeful behavior in each manifestation. Photography would reveal figures that cast no shadows or cast multiple shadows in different directions. Audio recordings would capture conversations involving voices that didn't correspond to any visible speakers. The family's criminal activities operated on levels that traditional law enforcement couldn't adequately address. They didn't just commit crimes, they altered the reality in which those crimes occurred, making it impossible to establish what had actually happened or who was responsible. Witnesses would provide testimony that was internally consistent but completely contradicted by physical evidence. Evidence would exist in forms that made no logical sense, seeming to prove multiple contradictory versions of events simultaneously. As Agent Mills and his team established their positions around what intelligence indicated was the primary Ashford compound, they began to experience the disorienting effects that had been reported by previous surveillance teams. Time seemed to move differently within the family's territory. Clocks would show different times despite being synchronized. Radio communications would arrive before they were sent or would be received by agents who hadn't yet transmitted them. The compound itself presented visual contradictions that hurt to observe directly. Buildings appeared to be simultaneously occupied and abandoned, new and ancient, solid and translucent. Smoke rose from chimneys of structures that showed no signs of habitation. Lights moved behind windows of buildings that surveillance had confirmed were empty. Agent Mills activated his radio to coordinate the final approach, but instead of reaching his tactical team, he found himself in conversation with someone claiming to be his grandfather, who had died 20 years earlier. The voice was unmistakably familiar, discussing details of Mills's childhood that no one else could have known. The conversation lasted 17 minutes according to Mills's watch, but when he checked with his team, they reported that no radio transmission had occurred and that Mills had been silent for over an hour. This was the moment when federal authorities began to understand that they weren't just dealing with sophisticated criminals. They were confronting something that existed outside the normal parameters of reality, something that could manipulate the fundamental structures of consciousness and existence in ways that made conventional law enforcement meaningless. The Ashford family's mastery of consciousness manipulation had developed over generations through practices that combined ancient techniques with innovations that shouldn't have been possible given their historical isolation. They had learned to exist in what they called the spaces between thoughts, operating in the gaps and inconsistencies of human awareness, where contradictory realities could coexist without resolution. Their criminal empire wasn't built on territory or resources, but on their ability to control how people experienced reality itself. They could make victims forget that crimes had occurred while simultaneously making them remember events that had never happened. They could alter the past selectively, changing some elements of historical events while leaving others intact, creating paradoxes that drove investigators to mental breakdown. What made them particularly dangerous to law enforcement was their apparent immunity to conventional investigation techniques. Physical evidence would transform or disappear when examined. Witnesses would provide detailed testimony about events, and then, minutes later, have no memory of either the events or their testimony. Legal documents would be found altered in ways that suggested they had always contained different information, even when investigators had photographed the original versions. As federal forces attempted to execute their coordinated assault on Ashford territory, they discovered that the family had been aware of their plans not through conventional intelligence gathering, but through what appeared to be direct access to federal agents' thoughts and memories. Agents would find themselves following tactical plans that they had never received, responding to orders that had never been given, coordinating with team members who didn't exist. The assault quickly devolved into chaos as agents lost the ability to distinguish between their actual mission and false memories that the Ashfords were implanting in real time. Some agents found themselves arresting colleagues they were convinced were Ashford family members. Others became convinced that they themselves were Ashfords and began working against their own teams. Still others simply vanished, leaving behind equipment and documentation suggesting they had never been part of the operation. Agent Mills, who had maintained some level of coherent awareness through training techniques he had learned for resisting psychological manipulation, managed to reach what appeared to be the main Ashford residence. But upon entering, he found himself in a building that was simultaneously a rustic mountain cabin, a modern office complex, a medieval castle, and something that his mind couldn't process at all. In the central room, he encountered what he believed to be the Ashford family patriarch, though encountered might not be the correct term. The figure existed in multiple states simultaneously, sometimes appearing as an elderly mountain man, sometimes as a well-dressed businessman, sometimes as something that Mills's perception refused to resolve into any recognizable form. The conversation that followed, documented in Mills's classified report, challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness, reality, and human identity. The Ashford patriarch explained that reality was far more malleable than most people understood, that consciousness was not confined to individual brains, but was a field that could be manipulated by those who understood its true nature. The family had learned these techniques, the figure claimed, through contact with something that existed in the deepest parts of the Appalachian Mountains, something that had been teaching selected human lineages how to transcend the limitations of conventional existence. The Ashfords were not just criminals. They were pioneers exploring forms of consciousness that represented the next stage of human evolution. But this evolution came with costs that became apparent as Mills continued his investigation. The Ashford family members were no longer entirely human in any meaningful sense. They existed in multiple realities simultaneously, but this meant they had no stable identity or consistent existence. They could manipulate consciousness, but they had lost the ability to experience consciousness in normal human terms. Most disturbing was the revelation that the Ashford techniques were spreading. They had been teaching selected individuals throughout Appalachia and beyond, creating a network of consciousness manipulators who could alter reality in localized areas. These students were establishing their own territories where normal physical laws and logical consistency no longer applied. The federal government's response to the Ashford investigation was unprecedented. Rather than continuing attempts at conventional law enforcement, authorities declared the entire region a restricted zone and sealed all records of the operation. Agent Mills and the few other agents who retained coherent memories of their experiences were transferred to classified facilities where they spent years undergoing psychological evaluation and memory reconstruction. The official report stated that the Ashford family had been successfully dispersed and their criminal organization dismantled. But classified documents suggest that no arrests were made, no family members were apprehended, and no physical evidence of their activities was recovered. Instead, federal authorities simply withdrew from the region and established monitoring stations at a safe distance. The monitoring continues today, with satellite surveillance and remote sensing equipment tracking phenomena in former Ashford territory that government scientists cannot explain. Consciousness researchers working for classified government programs study the reports from these monitors, trying to understand how human awareness can be weaponized and whether defenses can be developed against consciousness-based attacks. Perhaps most troubling are the reports from other regions where similar phenomena have been detected. Reality distortions consistent with Ashford techniques have been documented in isolated areas across the United States and internationally. Government psychologists have identified what they call consciousness warfare as an emerging threat that could destabilize fundamental assumptions about truth, memory, and identity on a global scale. The legacy of the deadliest Appalachian families extends far beyond their individual crimes and regional influence. They represented evolutionary experiments in human consciousness and behavior, testing the limits of what people could become when freed from conventional moral and physical constraints. Their techniques for manipulation, control, and reality alteration became templates for forms of warfare and social control that continue to influence global politics and international relations. But perhaps most significantly, they proved that human consciousness itself is far more malleable and vulnerable than most people realize. In an age of information warfare, social media manipulation, and psychological operations, the lessons learned from studying these mountain families have become essential for understanding how truth and reality can be weaponized by those who understand the weaknesses in human perception and memory. The Appalachian Mountains still hold their secrets, but they also continue to serve as laboratories for exploring the darkest possibilities of human evolution. In the deepest hollows, where federal monitoring equipment still detects anomalies that science cannot explain, something continues to teach selected bloodlines how to transcend the limitations of normal human existence. The 9 deadliest Appalachian families may be gone, but their legacy lives on in techniques for manipulating consciousness, controlling reality, and weaponizing truth itself that pose ongoing threats to social stability and human understanding. They showed us that evil, like any other human capacity, can evolve and advance in ways that challenge our fundamental assumptions about what is possible. In the end, the most terrifying truth about these criminal dynasties isn't what they accomplished, but what they revealed about the potential for human consciousness to be manipulated, controlled, and ultimately weaponized by those willing to abandon conventional moral constraints. They were pioneers of forms of warfare that target not just individuals or communities, but reality itself. The mountains remember everything, including the lessons about consciousness and reality that these families discovered in their explorations of human evil. And as our world becomes increasingly connected and digitized, creating new vulnerabilities in human perception and awareness, perhaps it's time we paid closer attention to what those ancient ridges learned about the weaponization of consciousness itself. The deadliest Appalachian families are gone, but the questions they raised about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human identity remain as relevant today as they were in the shadow-carved valleys where they first learned to reshape the world through the manipulation of awareness itself.